Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the Holy Trinity of War as presented by Clausewitz in his classic book on war. Herodotus famously said once about war that in peace times sons bury their fathers, whereas in war times fathers bury their sons. After the Second World War, the devastation seemed to have convinced the world, especially the Europeans, that never again. Never again. But just a cursory look at the list of wars conducted from 1945 till now, all around the world, will convince anyone that war continues to be an integral part of human society. We would have remembered this if we would have listened to Clausewitz properly. He was born in 1780 in Prussia and spent most of his time in the Prussian army, starting from a very young age. His participation in the Napoleonic Wars is well documented, but many soldiers go to war. What was so special about Clausewitz? His time on the battlefield was spent as much on fighting at the front as thinking about it. And furthermore, he decided to condense his 30 plus years of experience in a book that is now read in almost every military institution around the world, called On War, which he decided to publish after various revisions in 1832. It is believed that he had much more to write, and he left the book unfinished because unfortunately he was mortal, and death took him away from this theater of war-mongering humans. There are many principles and theories in his book, but we are going to discuss the most famous idea that he presented in the book, which he termed the Trinity of War, and most probably was the most consequential theory of his lifetime, because military scholars consider it to be one of the last edits he did to the book before he died. The famous passage appears in chapter 1, book 1. Let's read it and see what he has to say. War is more than a true chameleon that slightly adapts its characteristics to the given case. As a total phenomenon, its dominant tendencies always make war a remarkable trinity composed of primordial violence, hatred, and enmity, which are to be regarded as a blind natural force, of the play of chance and probability within which the creative spirit is free to roam, and of its element of subordination as an instrument of policy, which makes it subject to reason alone. The very first line is worth a second reflection. A chameleon is famous for changing colors according to the environment in which it finds itself. That is its survival mechanism. That is how it lives. Obviously, this line is understood usually in terms of the adaptability of war to the circumstances. Clausewitz asserts that there is no one rule or principle of war. Every war is different because every war originates from a different set of social, global, or regional circumstances, thereby making it necessary for the government, the army, and the public to adapt their policies, strategies, and emotions to the new situation at hand. But is that it? There is another dimension in this chameleon metaphor that requires some thought. For a chameleon, just like a war, the adaptability to every new situation is necessary to sustain its longevity. This is where the philosopher in Clausewitz stuns us. He is also subtly giving the reasons for why war has always remained a part of human history. Because no matter what, there is always a reason, a strategy, an army, new technology, tactics, and policies that justify wars. And we accept it as a matter of fact. Now let's come to the famous Trinity Theory of War. Clausewitz has in mind not just the army generals when he is talking about this trinity. He has also the government and the public in mind. Because the army is primarily the task force that carries out the war, whereas the government, which can also be the army itself, goes through the decision-making process of deciding upon the policies of war, and the public who wants to understand what is happening. So the Trinity is as helpful to a general as to the policymaker, and in the same manner most important for the analyst whose interest lies in understanding war. He considers three elements, or as he puts it, three magnets, between which war is placed and should be understood according to their relative gravitational or magnetic force. The first one he calls the blind natural force, the passion of the public for war, their enthusiasm to wage a war against their enemy. Let's summarize it in a term: passions. This is the irrational element. Then the second element is what he calls the play of chance and probability, within which the creative spirit is free to roam, which in other words can be summarized as chance and courage. This element corresponds to the skill and technological means of the military. The arena of war primarily belongs to the army, and it is considered rightly so. But we should not forget that there is no clear demarcation between the public and the army, because the army is selected from the public and lives in them. In ancient Greece and Rome, for example, there was no such thing as a citizen. There were only citizen soldiers. Every citizen was also a part of the military. Then there is a third element that Clausewitz calls element of subordination as an instrument of policy which makes it subject to reason alone. This corresponds to the government policy and the only element that he is prepared to call the rational element. The primary motivation for rationalizing this element seems to be the concentration of deliberation and authority in the government body. It is the government's task to announce the war, which informs the public and its adversary that now it is finally time to go to the battlefield, or at least keep an eye out on the battlefield. So Clausewitz considers the role of the government to be based on rationality. But again, here is another caveat. The governments are elected by the public, and the elected people are chosen from the public. Or in the case of dictatorship as well, the tyrant at least is considered the citizen of the country. In both cases, the public is not a separate entity that functions separately from the government. To summarize the trinity of war, it is passion, chance and courage, and rationality. It would have seemed a bit confusing that there is no mention of the public, the army, or the government. Then why have these elements been superimposed upon the trinity? Does not this seem to mislead the interpretation of the Trinity? Clausewitz has something to say about this. Right after the passage mentioned before, he writes the following. The first of these three aspects mainly concerns the people, the second the commander and his army, the third the government. The passions that are to be kindled in war must already be inherent in the people. The scope which the play of courage and talent will enjoy in the realm of probability and chance depends on the particular character of the commander and the army, but the political aims are the business of government alone. After having described the metaphysical and psychological structure of the Trinity, he superimposes it with the material structure, the real actors of war, so to say. Therefore, it is easy to misunderstand the Trinity as the army, the public, and the government in essence. But that is not what he wants to postulate. He understands the dynamic structure of human society. There are no clear lines between the army, the public, and the government in theory, which is why he does not equate each factor with its material manifestation. Rather, he talks about concerns. We as humans have the capacity to take a decision in a professional environment and in a civil environment, but they differ remarkably. Obviously, they are subconsciously affected by each other. What is the use of this theory? Why did you give such a condensed version of such a complicated phenomenon called war, Clausewitz? Let's listen to his answer. He says, these three tendencies are like three different codes of law, deep-rooted in their subject and yet variable in their relationship to one another. A theory that ignores any one of them or seeks to fix an arbitrary relationship between them would conflict with reality to such an extent that for this reason alone it would be totally useless. Our task, therefore, is to develop a theory that maintains the balance between these three tendencies, like an object suspended between three magnets. What he wants an analyst and the policymaker to do is to look at war from the lens of the Trinity. It will start to make more sense as to why humans actually decide to take each other's lives en masse. His main reason for providing the Trinity is help us understand the nature of human society. It is made up as such that war always remains suspended between the public, the army, and the government, as if these three social entities are interconnected in such a way that they each can contribute to either the waging of the war or its suspension. Let's take an example. If there is a barbarian enemy who is constantly troubling the citizen body, the emotions will run high, and these civilians have the power to influence the policy of the government. And at the same time, the temperature of the situation will alert the army that they should get themselves prepared. On the other hand, it could equally happen that the government has become irrational in waging a war, and the public from below takes to the street and swings the pendulum of decision-making mechanism away from the government and the army, and brings the decisions rewarding war close to the rationalized passion, thereby pressuring the government to end the war. So it is possible in theory in the Trinity, the rational and the irrational elements can switch places between the public and the government. Our primary focus when considering questions about war should be on the essential trinity of passions, chance and courage, and rationality, and then on the actors. Because as explained by Clausewitz himself, these are tendencies that any social entity or even a combination of them can partake. Clausewitz's theory is the product of the Napoleonic Wars, but it is such a comprehensive framework that it can be applied to any war even before the Napoleonic Wars to understand it. In the same manner, this is not a theory of the past. Today, political leaders want to save their electoral base and follow the policy of war to remain in power, even if the decision is rash and irrational. I conclude with Clausewitz's famous dictum that has been challenged, but it seems to have survived the test of times. War is the continuation of politics by other means. Thank you, everyone.